The first thing I noticed was the way her hand trembled against my sleeve, not from fear of me, but from the humiliation burning through her veins as she leaned close and whispered, barely breathing, "Will you dance with me? My ex is watching." And in that split second, under the chandelier light of a downtown Chicago ballroom, with violins floating through the air and crystal glasses chiming against polished marble, I wondered what you would have done if you were in my place. Would you have stepped forward for a stranger whose pride was cracking in front of you? Or would you have stepped aside and let her stand alone in the wreckage of her past? Her name was Madison. She wore a deep blue dress that clung to her frame like it had been stitched from midnight itself, and yet nothing about her posture said confidence. It said survival. It said, "Don't let them see you bleed." Across the room stood a tall man with slicked back hair and a smirk that carried history, the kind of history that leaves scars under clothing and behind smiles. His name was Trevor. He held a champagne flute and the hand of a woman who looked carved from social media filters and expensive boredom. He wasn't watching Madison with love. He was watching her with ownership, as if her dignity were something he'd misplaced and expected to find again tonight. I hadn't planned on attending the charity gala at all. Babysitters were expensive even when you could afford them, and I'd long ago learned that money didn't quiet the guilt of leaving your child at home. My daughter Ava was 7, stubborn and brilliant, with curls that refused to obey gravity and a laugh that mended things in me I didn't know were broken. Since my wife, Hannah, passed from a sudden aneurysm 3 years earlier, it had been just the two of us in a brownstone on the north side. People assumed wealth erased grief. It didn't. It only gave you more rooms to feel it in. I'd built my tech company from a rented garage in Evanston when I was 24, living off ramen and ambition. By 35, I'd sold it for more money than my father had made in his entire life working construction. Headlines called me a visionary. Investors called me disciplined. But when Hannah died, none of that mattered. I was just a man who didn't know how to braid hair properly and cried in the shower so his daughter wouldn't hear. So when Madison's fingers tightened against my sleeve, something in me recognized that look. The look of someone who had once trusted the wrong person and paid for it in installments of self-worth. I didn't know her story yet, but I knew the language of quiet suffering. I set my glass down and placed my hand at the small of her back. It felt fragile there, as if she might collapse inward if not held steady. The band shifted into a slow standard, and we stepped onto the dance floor. Her ex watched. Of course he did. His jaw flexed, his grip on his new partner tightening slightly. People like Trevor didn't like losing control of the narrative. Madison's perfume carried a faint trace of vanilla and something sharper beneath it, maybe determination. Up close, I saw the faintest shimmer in her eyes that wasn't entirely from the overhead lights. She was fighting tears, fighting the humiliation of being left for someone wealthier, flashier, someone who fit better in photos. You see, Trevor came from old money. Madison didn't. She grew up in Peoria, the daughter of a nurse and a truck driver. She put herself through community college working double shifts at a diner, eventually earning a marketing degree and clawing her way into a mid-level firm in Chicago. She met Trevor at a networking event, dazzled by his confidence and the effortless way doors opened for him. For 2 years, she believed she was building a future. Then one Tuesday afternoon, he told her over coffee that he needed someone who understood his lifestyle, someone more aligned with his world. The translation was simple: someone richer. When Madison told me this later, weeks after that dance, she did so without self-pity. But that night, on the dance floor, the wound was still fresh. He'd invited her to this gala knowing she'd see him with someone new. He'd wanted her to see the upgrade. As we moved together, I felt her begin to steady. Not because I was extraordinary, but because sometimes all a person needs is not to be alone in the moment they're being judged. Trevor's gaze shifted from smug to uncertain. He didn't recognize me. I'd kept my life intentionally private after the company sale, declining magazine covers and interviews. The tux I wore was tailored but understated. I looked like a man who blended into a crowd, not someone whose net worth could buy the building we were standing in. Madison pulled back slightly, studying my face as if trying to memorize it. She thanked me under her breath, then straightened her shoulders. When the song ended, she didn't rush away. She walked back to the bar with a grace that hadn't been there before. We talked after that. Not in dramatic confessions, not in grand declarations. We talked like two tired adults who had lived through enough to know that fairy tales were fragile things. She told me she'd almost skipped the event, that part of her wanted to prove she was still standing. I told her I understood the instinct to show the world you hadn't been broken beyond repair. Over the next month, we ran into each other twice more. Once at a coffee shop near Millennium Park where she sat grading a stack of papers for a freelance client, brow furrowed in concentration. Once at a grocery store where she stood comparing generic cereal brands because the organic one was $5 more, and she had student loans to think about. That was the moment I realized how different our financial realities were. I could have bought the entire aisle without blinking. She was calculating quarters. I didn't tell her who I was. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to know who she saw when she looked at me. I drove an older SUV instead of the Tesla in my garage. I wore jeans instead of designer suits. When she asked what I did, I told her I worked in tech consulting. It wasn't a lie, just an omission. We started seeing each other quietly. Walks along Lake Michigan, cheap tacos in Pilsen, movie nights at my house after Ava had gone to sleep, though I kept introductions slow. Ava had already lost one woman she loved. I wasn't going to gamble her heart lightly. Madison carried her own insecurities into every room. When we passed high-end boutiques on Michigan Avenue, she'd glance at the windows, then quickly away, as if wanting something too beautiful might expose her. She paid half for every dinner, even when I protested gently. Independence had become her armor. One evening, she admitted that Trevor had texted her after the gala. He'd said he was surprised to see her move on so quickly, as if 2 years with him had been something she needed his permission to recover from. She deleted the message without responding, but the fact that it lingered told me he still occupied a corner of her doubt. What she didn't know was that Trevor's family office had once pitched my company for acquisition years before I sold it elsewhere. I remembered his father's name from meetings, the subtle arrogance of inherited power. I had no desire to play that game. My silence about my wealth wasn't strategy, it was self-preservation. I'd seen what money did to relationships, how it distorted intentions, inflated egos, created invisible scoreboards. But as Madison grew closer to Ava, as I watched her kneel on the living room floor helping my daughter build a cardboard castle, something shifted. Ava laughed more when Madison was around. She braided Ava's curls better than I ever could. She listened to her stories about school with genuine interest, not obligation. One Sunday afternoon, we took Ava to the zoo. Madison packed sandwiches from her small apartment kitchen, apologizing that they weren't fancy. I told her they were perfect. Watching her hold Ava's hand as they pointed at giraffes, I felt a warmth that terrified me. Hope is a dangerous thing when you've buried a spouse. The reveal came not from me, but from a business magazine left open on a cafe table. We ducked inside to escape a sudden rainstorm. Madison flipped through the pages idly while I ordered coffee. When I returned, she was staring at a full-page profile with my younger face smiling back at her above the headline about one of Chicago's youngest tech entrepreneurs who'd cashed out for 9 figures. She didn't speak for a long time. She just looked from the page to me and back again. Not anger, not excitement. Something more complicated. Hurt. "You didn't trust me," her eyes seemed to say without words. I tried to explain. About privacy. About wanting to be seen without the weight of numbers attached, about protecting Ava. But explanations can sound like excuses when someone feels deceived. Madison left early that day. For a week, she didn't answer my calls. When she finally agreed to meet, it was at the same ballroom where we'd first danced, empty this time except for staff preparing for another event. She stood in the center of the room, hands clasped tightly. She told me that Trevor had always made money the center of everything. That she'd spent 2 years feeling like she was constantly being evaluated against bank accounts and social status. Discovering my wealth without knowing felt like stepping back into a room she'd fought to escape. I listened. I didn't defend. I told her I understood why she felt that way, that I should have trusted her with the truth sooner, that I was afraid. Afraid of what? She asked softly. Afraid that if you knew, you'd see me differently. Or worse, that you wouldn't, and I'd realize I'd misjudged you. Silence stretched between us like a tightrope. Then she did something I didn't expect. She stepped closer and placed her hand over my heart. She said she didn't care about the money. She cared that I hadn't believed she was strong enough to handle the truth, that she'd spent her life proving she wasn't fragile. Trust, once cracked, doesn't mend overnight. But we decided to try. I brought her into my full world gradually, the foundation meetings, the investment calls, the quiet philanthropic work I'd funded in neighborhoods not unlike where she'd grown up. She saw that my wealth wasn't a trophy, but a tool. She also saw the exhaustion in it, the way people angled conversations when they realized who I was. One night, months later, we attended another gala. This time, I didn't blend in. My name was announced. Heads turned. Trevor was there again, his new relationship already fraying at the edges. He saw us together, saw Madison's hand in mine, saw the respect in the way people greeted her as my partner. But the most important moment wasn't his reaction, it was Madison's. She didn't cling to me to prove anything. She didn't scan the room for his approval. She stood tall because she had rebuilt herself from the inside out. Money hadn't saved her. Love hadn't rescued her. She had done the hard work of healing, and I had simply walked beside her. Later that evening, under the same chandelier lights where she'd once trembled, she asked me to dance again. Not because someone was watching, but because she wanted to. As we moved across the floor, I thought about how close I'd come to missing her, how easy it would have been to decline that first request, to let pride or inconvenience keep me seated. Life rarely announces its turning points. Sometimes they arrive disguised as a stranger's whispered plea. Madison eventually moved into the brownstone. Ava taped one of her drawings to Madison's suitcase the day she unpacked, a stick figure portrait of the three of us holding hands under a bright, uneven sun. Grief didn't disappear from our home. Hannah's photos still lined the hallway, but instead of competing with memory, Madison honored it. She told Ava stories about strong women. She never tried to replace what had been lost. Trevor drifted into irrelevance, not because he lost money or status, but because Madison no longer measured herself against him. The power he once held dissolved when she stopped seeking his validation. Years from now, when Ava is grown and perhaps facing her own crossroads, I hope she remembers that her father once stood up for a woman who needed a partner in a humiliating moment. And I hope she remembers that strength sometimes looks like asking for a dance. Before this story ends, tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were in that ballroom. Would you have stepped forward or stayed seated? Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness rewrite entire futures. Madison's whisper could have been swallowed by music and pride. Instead, it became the first note in a song that rebuilt two broken hearts and gave a little girl another reason to believe in love. If this story truly touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, only if it reminded you that second chances are worth the risk.